just wanted to welcome everybody today. I'm Jennifer Gerst. I'm the project director for Reading Within Reach project, which is a 5-year initiative funded through USAID and managed by URC. And I wanted to just take a second to allow our CEO, Jay Wexler, to welcome everybody today before I continue.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to URC. And I hope this meeting for you is very, very productive. I know it took a lot of people to get to this point, and thank you very much for all of the contributions that you've made. I'm glad to be a part of this, Jennifer. I've stayed close with the REACH project over the time here, and for me it's been a very good learning experience. I still have plenty to learn, so sooner or later I'll learn to read. But thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy your stay here. Welcome.
Thank you. And I also wanted to just note Terry Ferrari, who is our great supporter in the International Development Division for this project. So thanks for joining us, Terry. Our project aims to advance reading in the primary grades around the world by establishing a community of practice. So it's exciting to see disabilities advocates, practitioners, scholars in the room today. This is one of our many community of practices that we're starting to cultivate and form through the Global Reading Network by the availability of products such as these. We also work on consolidating and disseminating reading research, essential to improve programming. We provide professional development, and we develop protocols and tools which support design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And we are trialing some innovations, mostly in the area of technology. We're excited about launching this toolkit today. It's the first time it has been developed. The process started in September last year, and it's been a participatory process involving many members of the Global Reading Network, practitioners, academics, researchers, and donors working on this issue. In May of this year, we also co-hosted a meeting with the World Bank, which for the first time brought together people with technical knowledge on reading and disabilities with international practitioners to address literacy and learning for all children at their early years. And all this expertise went into the development of the toolkit. I want to thank everyone here and also online in terms of participating in this webinar today. We're really grateful to Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, the Disability Advisor at the World Bank, to be our discussant today. And she was a great supporter. She helped us put together an event in May. We have a diverse group of participants in the room, including people with disabilities, parents of children with disabilities, siblings of people who have disabilities, and also various educational disability organizations. And your participation will help us further disseminate this toolkit. And we are going to provide you a link to the toolkit to download it after the presentation today. And we have, I think, something like 5 copies sort of wandering around the tables. And let us know if you want to take a look at it immediately so we can snatch it from the person who's talking it at the moment. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work behind this. Ann Hayes, the lead researcher on the toolkit we've been working with, and she is such a delight. If you all get a chance to work with her, she has so much passion and she works so hard. I also want to thank Ann Turnbull, who I think is online, who supported the research on the toolkit, and also, of course, Norman Moran, who's right here in the front, who supported the toolkit in the area of deaf education. USAID staff, Rebecca Rhodes, who's the acting team lead for reading, and of course Josh Joseph, who all of you know as well, who's the disabilities advisor at USAID. They wanted to share their apologies. They can't be here today. They are working very hard on getting the U.S. government strategy out. They were told not to leave downtown. And I wanted to thank my colleague at Reach, Deepa Shrikantaya, who's back here, who has been our staff member. Deepa is probably the one you know much better than me. She's probably been in contact with most every one of you for some inputs and support along the way. And also, of course, Richard Felty. He's works with Deepa. He's out today, but he did a lot of kind of like the cruise direction around the office related to the toolkit. Andre Lafleur, who you just met, who's our operations manager, and of course Lynn Alexander, who puts all our events together for Global Reading Network. Dan Hayes will present, and Charlotte will follow with discussant remarks. And we ask you hold your questions for the answer session. And I was told to share this really fun quote from Dr. Seuss, so I'm going to share this today. Dr. Seuss says, "The more that you read, the more things you will know. The more that you learn, the more places you'll go." So by so doing, you will help ensure that children with disabilities learn more and have places to go. And so I just want to kind of say how excited I am to be around folks who are so passionate about this work. We look forward to kind of speaking with you about how to take advantage of this toolkit. We're thinking about creating a user community around the toolkit to help us think about a second edition, to help monitor where it goes, the places it reaches, what's happening, the policy and strategy. So we hope that you'll respond when we get back to you about that, okay? I want to read some bios about Anne and Charlotte. Anne has more than 20 years of technical expertise focusing on disability and inclusive development, inclusive education, gender, and human rights, working in more than 30 countries in Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Middle East, the whole world, basically. And is the author for the toolkit, which was supported by USAID. She's worked previously as the Senior Technical Advisor at Perkins School for the Blind, the Director of Collaborative Initiatives at the World Bank's Global Partnership on Disability and Development. She's been the Disability and Gender Specialist at USAID, and she currently works as an independent consultant, supporting a variety of programming globally, various NGOs, contractors, UN and disabled persons organizations. She's published many documents related to inclusive education and inclusion of persons with disabilities, including the results of research on disability inclusiveness in USAID, solicitations, and several guides related to inclusive education, Master's in International Education from George Washington University, and she's the proud mom of 2 young children, one of which has a disability with complex communication and support needs. So she does this from the heart. Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, okay? She's the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank. Her work at the World Bank focuses on disability inclusive development under its twin goals to end poverty and promote shared prosperity. As the disability advisor, she supports operational teams across the institution to ensure policies, programs, and projects are disability inclusive. She leads the production of analytical products, analyzing and articulating bank policy on disability and development. And in 2011, as a well-respected human rights lawyer and disability and children and child rights, she was appointed by President Obama to lead USAID's work on disability inclusive development. That included developing policies and country strategies to technical assistance for program implementation. She worked previously as a senior operations officer in the World Bank, East Asia, Pacific, and Africa regions. And early in her career, she was appointed by President Nelson Mandela as a commissioner to the South African Human Rights Commission, where she focused on social and economic rights, disability rights, and child rights. From 1996 to 98, she worked for UNICEF, also as a child protection officer, and she has multiple law degrees in international law and administration from the University of Warsaw, Cornell, and Cornell. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Anne is it Anne first? Yeah, to get started with our presentation and take you through the toolkit parts, and then we'll turn it over to Charlotte, and then after which we'll take your questions.
So starting out, I want to thank everyone again, but just know that this has been such a collaborative effort, and so many people that helped with the collaboration are in this room and are online. So thank you. I won't say it all out loud, but you know who you are, and it's much appreciated, as well as the URC team and USAID and my other authors. It is definitely, I keep saying it's so much, it's more than just giving birth because it's longer gestational period. So it's, but it has definitely been an amazing labor of love, and it's exciting to see so much interest in this area and the growing interest that we just haven't seen before. And I really hope we can take this interest and start putting in the best practices and start educating people on how we do this. So today, what I'm going to do is give you an overview of why this toolkit is needed, who the audience is for the toolkit, what is actually in the toolkit. I won't go into too much details because you can tell it's a pretty hefty binded program, but I will also then talk about how you can use it. That's how you and other stakeholders can use it. Why is toolkit needed? As you guys are probably very familiar, we know that 15% of any population has a disability, and you've probably seen some of these statistics before, but when you stop and think about it, it's pretty staggering. It's staggering to think that 90% of children with disabilities are not in school, and that only 1% to 2% of children are deaf actually get education in sign language, that we're still doing oral instruction, which we don't know just doesn't work, but we're still doing it. And that 5 to 15% children that need assistive devices, only 5 to 15% have them. And typically that's been in the form of wheelchairs and canes, but we're not thinking broader about what that means. And the other thing we know is that children with intellectual, complex support needs, and emotional disabilities are at the greatest disadvantage. And if you are a girl, impoverished, or an ethnic minority, those disadvantages become even more so. The other reason we know that this is needed is that there's been some rhetoric, even more so since the UN Convention was signed, but we talk a lot about inclusive education. We talk about why it's needed or where they should be educated, but we really haven't started getting down into the how. How do we do this? What does it look like? And so we really need to start getting those tools. The other thing is that even though we've got some little examples here and there, most early grade reading programs fail to adequately address the learning needs of children with disabilities. Maybe it's because the donor's not asking for it. Maybe it's because the implementers don't know how to do it. Maybe it's because they've done one activity and they feel like they just check the box and walk away. Or maybe it's because they don't think they're important. I've heard we need to educate normal, in quotes, kids before we educate other kids. So there's a lot of reasons why we're not doing it. We have some good examples that we've tried to highlight in the toolkit, but we're just overall not doing it. The other thing is, we have the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're still doing programs that aren't aligned with it. Donor-funded programs that reinforce segregation, that reinforce stigma and discrimination. So we really need to start thinking not just how we're doing it, but are we doing it well? And what does that look like? I think the other reason, I think my own personal experiences, you mentioned in my bio, was that I'm also a mother of a child with a disability. My son's essentially nonverbal. He uses an iPad to talk. I've never been to a low middle income country that would accept my son into school, any school. And so if I lived in those countries, he's literate. He's very bright. He's doing well. He's got a great team that's given him those, he's in 3rd grade. He's learning his sciences through literacy. But if I lived in these other countries, he wouldn't have gotten that opportunity. People would look at him and assume he couldn't learn. So he wouldn't go to school. He wouldn't get a job. He wouldn't be able to become a self-advocate. And I think about what the ripple effect would be for us. I wouldn't be here today because I would have had to quit my job that I love in order to stay at home. Because he wouldn't have a job, he probably would have to receive welfare. So something we'd have to think about as a family and as his sibling of how we can support him in the future. So I really think, and I think also what was interesting is though we each came with our different technical areas, the other 2 authors also are mothers of children with disabilities. And their children would have been denied education, either because they had multiple disabilities, as Norma's son had, or because they were deaf or hard of hearing like Norma's sons. So I think the main reason we're doing this is because honestly, we are failing these kids. We are not doing enough. And so I think the toolkit is needed so that we start doing more. So who's the audience of the toolkit? We wrote it pretty broadly. It's mainly USAID staff, other donors, so we hope that groups like World Bank and UNICEF and DFID can take this on, Ministry of Education leadership, program implementers like yourselves, as well as academics, families of persons with children with disabilities, and as well as DPOs, getting the right information to them so they can be the best advocates. So what types of disabilities are covered in the toolkit? I think the main thing we want to say is actually we think this toolkit benefits all children, students with and without disabilities. But as we started looking at the evidence base, there are some different instructional techniques that help different types of disabilities. And so we did categorize them. I don't like putting people in a box or labeling, but for this we kind of felt we needed to kind of help that a little bit. So essentially it is students who are blind or have low vision, students with complex communication disorders, so children who have a hard time speaking either because of physical disabilities or neurological or intellectual, children who are deaf and hard of hearing, children with intellectual disabilities and complex support needs, children with learning, emotional, and attentional disabilities, and this is a really important thing because we don't look at this in international, and I think these are the kids that are in school but are dropping out because they're not getting the certain supports they needed, and children with multiple disabilities, and these children fall off the radar all the time. If you are deaf and autistic, most times deaf school's not going to take you because they don't know how to address autism, and most schools, the children for autism aren't going to take you because they don't know sign language. So the result is you get to stay at home. So you may notice a couple things that aren't mentioned here. We don't mention autism specifically because we talked to the different technical experts and they said because autism is such a broad spectrum, they fall into lots of different categories depending on the child. So that's why we address them. We talk about that, but they're not a category alone. You also notice that physical and mobility disabilities are in here. mainly because for them, it's about access, accessibility, and maybe some additional support for writing. But they don't require additional instructional techniques for the most part. So we talk about the importance of accessibility, but we don't go through those instructional techniques. But again, I think the important thing is it's for all children. So how is it organized? It's a big document, and we did this intentionally. Once you start digging in, we decided we're going to show it all. We're going to show what it should be and pretty much everything we think are the highlighted areas. We may have forgotten some, but luckily this is the first edition, so we'll get your input and add to it. But the first chapter is really introduction, and we explain universal design for learning and what literacy really means for children with disabilities. The second chapter is what are the holistic supports? What systematic changes need to happen in order to allow children to learn literacy? It's not just about instructional techniques for many children. They need additional supports. And the third chapter really digs into literacy. So we talk about phases of literacy. We talk about the different instructional techniques. And what's really interesting is when we started thinking about this, we thought, okay, well, how do we do literacy for children who are deaf? And we thought, well, we could do a lot of research, or we could just reach out to a person who spent her entire career writing about literacy for persons who are deaf. So she wrote that section for us. And we did that for every single group. We have academics and technical experts who have spent their entire career researching and writing about this, who helped design this. And we frame it in a universal design for learning framework. So just those expertise has just been such a rich, it's just been amazing to learn from them. And then the last chapter is, okay, these are some great theories, but how do you take it into practice? What do you guys do with this? What does it look like going from theory into practice? And we talk about maybe some do's and don'ts, and we'll go through that later. So I think what I want to really mention is this is pretty comprehensive, and I don't think we're expecting a government in an African country to move forward in all of these things simultaneously. But if you don't know what it should look like, you don't have a goal to get to. So we wanted people to be able to say, well, we're doing teacher assistants. So then they can go and say, what should teacher assistants in the classroom look like? Or we're thinking about doing sign language. What should it look like? So that's why I think showing the spectrum of what it is, recognizing that people will move forward in different ways. But the important thing is that people move forward and have those tools to move forward. So the next thing is universal design for learning. And this is, for those of you who don't know, it comes from the concept of an architectural concept. So that if you make a building accessible for people with physical disabilities or people with communication disabilities, you're actually just making a better building. And that's the concept that we use for learning, that if you adapt your learning for children with disabilities, you're actually just doing better learning. Because what we learn is that all children receive information differently, communicate different information differently, and are motivated differently. And there's some, neurological terms in here. It's very evidence-based, but that's the sort of crux of it. For example, I'm a kinetic learner. I have to do something before I can learn. My husband has to see it, and that's it. So providing instruction that allows for all those different techniques just makes better instruction. And this is really the framework that we use and weave throughout. So, but as we started working on this, we realized, well, what is literacy? And how is literacy defined? So we started looking at some of the definitions of literacy and thought, well, these are inherently excluding many people with disabilities. They tend to be very based on print and text. They tend to be talking about how you can orally respond to reading. And we thought, well, this kind of rules out sign language and braille and tactile. So we felt like in order to really think of literacy, we need a more flexible definition. So definition needs to use multi-sensory approaches for students who use a variety of technologies, and that could be high and low, to help them effectively gain and communicate learning on an individual basis. These approaches, multi-sensory approaches, allow for concepts to be received through print, braille, tactile, symbolic, and others, and allow students to communicate their knowledge through diverse means, such as sign language, oral expression, and technology. So it's much broader. We also have some core principles that we think need to be running throughout. And I won't go through all of them, but I want to highlight a couple. And the first one that I think is so important is to presume competence. We don't always presume competence. Children aren't learning to read because we don't give them the opportunity to learn. So we need to look at every child and recognize every child can learn. I remember, I worked at Perkins, and they worked with children with some severe multiple disabilities. And I remember talking to a man, he said, I've never met a child who can't learn, ever. He's like, they learn their different ways, but all children learn. So I think if we keep that, we give opportunities, that's core to who we are. The other thing too is strength-based. Too often with disabilities, we just focus on what they can't do. And we know from learning that if we came with any other child and just created a program on what they can't do, that's ineffective. Real teaching and learning focuses on students' strengths as well, and that also applies to students with disabilities. We also need to keep in mind gender equity because of those differences between girls and boys with disabilities, as well as dignity, because we know that children with disabilities are at a risk of bullying and school-based sexual violence. So these are some principles that we want to kind of reinforce. So one of the questions that comes up is, well, where do you educate? We've talked about that. And I like this diagram because it gives a visual. And what we have first is exclusion. This is where kids don't even get to go to school, right? They're outside of the system. And then we have segregation, separate but equal, but they're never really equal, and so it's just separate. They're in a different school, they're in a different place. And then we have integration. A lot of people are calling this inclusion, and it's not. This is where we take a classroom, we put kids with disabilities, and they live in that classroom. Maybe they get to be with other kids for recess or lunch, but for academic instruction is a segregated place. That is not inclusion. Inclusion is where all children are integrated and educated together. And we'll go a little bit more on what that means. The other thing we also know is we have 40 years of research that inclusion benefits students with and without disabilities. And that is all students. Because people say, well, that's some, but not those children with intellectual. Nope, they benefit too. So inclusion is just the better way to go. It also is the one that we follow in this toolkit because it's mandated by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But I also want to step back and say inclusion for students who are deaf is different. Because if you take a child who's deaf and you put him in a classroom and he can't talk to any of his peers and he can't learn from his teacher, that is not inclusion, that's isolation. And so what we need to recognize, so we follow the World Federation for the Deaf's definition for inclusive education, which is recognizing that students who are deaf need to be in a communication-rich environment where they can communicate directly with their peers and their teachers using local sign language. And we give some examples of what that could look like in low and middle income countries. So when we talk about inclusion, I just want to let you know that we're also talking for the deaf, following the World Federation for the Deaf. So what is inclusion? And this is kind of small, so I won't read it all, but just a couple things. Inclusion means all, because what we're seeing in a lot of countries is we're doing inclusive education for what is deemed mild or what is deemed moderate. And I don't even know how they even decide that. But what happens is whoever is deemed severe, they don't get inclusion. In fact, they don't often get schools. So inclusion means everyone. And what we should also have is that it's educated in the general classroom, and it should be age appropriate. The other thing I've seen is that students with, say, intellectual disabilities don't get to go past second grade. And so, they should move up as with their peers. We know age appropriate is a problem in many countries, but at least it should be equitable, right? So it should be different for children with disabilities. And that every single child is regarded as a full and valued member. And I think that's what we want for every kid in schools in which we work. So the first chapter is holistic supports. And we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about the needs for policies and strategies, teacher training. I find it interesting. I've been to places that say, well, if we train all the general education teachers, we don't need special education teachers anymore. Nope, you're still going to need them. There's a tiered hierarchy. So we talk about what that hierarchy is, that all general education teachers are taught. There's still special education teachers, and there's still experts. A lot of those experts actually exist in a lot of the countries we work, but they're in segregated schools. So how do we start putting these, allowing them to start helping kids in mainstream inclusive schools? So the tiered level supports, also talking about, response to intervention and going through some of those. Instructional approaches, other supports, and holistic engagement with the people that matter. So just to go through a couple things, and again, there's a lot in there, but some of the things that I really want to highlight, because I think we're not always getting it, is individual education plans. They're really important for students with disabilities. What they should do is highlight what their needs are, what their strengths are, and what their accommodations are. And I recognize that an IEP for a child in rural Malawi is not going to look like my son's IEP, but that's not what we're suggesting. What we're suggesting is that there's some core principles of those IEPs, and we kind of go through them, that should be applied anywhere. Because I've seen IEPs that are 5 questions, and the only question that was not deficit was, what is your name? So, how do we get beyond that and think, what is the heart of the IEP, and how do we maintain that in a way that's usable in a low and middle income country? Another thing is equitable access to curriculum. This is a huge issue. And a lot of countries in which we're working, especially Africa, they're creating alternative curriculums for children with intellectual disabilities and often for students who are deaf. And they don't get to have access to the regular curriculum. We get to determine, like in intellectual, they get colors and crafts. And who determines? And in fact, I remember I was talking to a woman and I tried to say, well, look, every child should have the national curriculum. You just need to modify it and adapt it individually. But you can't come in and determine a child's worth. You can't look at a child and determine their ability. Only that child gets to determine that. And so she said, no, I get it. You don't understand what intellectual disability is. Let me explain it to you. So she, like the next 10 minutes, the most derogatory terms you could possibly imagine, I get this. And she said, this one child, he couldn't even talk. He couldn't even talk. How can you learn? He couldn't even talk. So I said, okay. Well, I was like, so I wrote it down on the paper and I said, I want you to Google this man when I leave. And I want you to think whether or not he could talk and if he could learn if he didn't talk. So I'm wondering, after reading Stephen Hawking's work, if he realized that your ability to communicate has nothing to do with your ability to learn. So we need to give every child that access and every child that presumption. Another issue is assistive technologies. As a donor community, we've been really focused on wheelchairs, and wheelchairs are important. I'm not anti-wheelchair, but it's just that it's so much more. And how do we know assistive technologies are a wonderful resource, especially for motivation and communication. So how do we get those in the hands of kids that need it? And USAID is also doing some additional work in this. So who should be involved? We have a lot of the typical people. We have families of children with disabilities, and we intentionally don't use the word parents. We use families, because in a lot of places we work, families look different. It could be a grandmother or an aunt or a sibling who's a primary caregiver. Everyone's important. Disabled persons organizations, so organizations made of people with disabilities, not necessarily for people with disabilities. All of communities, including children with and without disabilities, as well as students with disabilities. And this is something that's often excluded. We often don't involve their voice, and we need to, and that's a thing called self-determination that we go through. So the next we talk about are myths. We kind of break down some of these myths, and I'm not going to go through all these myths here. But like, for example, one of the myths I want to talk about is that every child within the same disability label will learn the same way. And that is just not true. There are some trends. We do know, for example, if you're deaf, you're going to learn better for literacy for finger spelling. But not every child who's deaf will learn that way. So we need to recognize that even though we're giving you some suggestions, it still needs to be individualized. So a next thing that we want to talk about is identification. And we were just saying this is kind of the buzzword right now in donor work. Everyone wants to know how to identify. Everyone wants to know how to screen and assess. Maybe it's our own personal need to kind of put people in boxes. I don't know. Maybe, you do need numbers. So, but I want to say right now, the important thing is identification. Real identification is to include, not exclude. So how do we create identifications that include, not exclude? The other thing is that identification really needs to be a phased process. The first thing you need to do is rule out all vision and hearing, because you can't decide if a child has a learning disability or if they're just not seeing the words on the page. So that we need to rule out. Then you can move into more screenings, and you have to use lots of different tools. You don't get to use one 6-thing checklist and determine a child. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. We have to give people those tools that work, and we give some suggestions of that how these tools can be culturally adapted and some tools that work in different environments. And then the last is sort of that evaluation. Those are sort of a smaller group of kids that continue to have learning needs, and you should do more detailed evaluation. But you need to look at them in different settings. How are they in math versus reading? What are their needs? And this is done through a multidisciplinary team. So the other thing that I want to talk about, because this is something that's going on, is there's often a misunderstanding between the census, identification, and diagnosis. So we tried to clarify that. Census is important. It helps us with data. It helps us know trends. But census is done through a series of questions with an acceptable level of error. When you're working with a child, there is no acceptable level of error. That needs to be individualized. We cannot take something, and in fact, Washington Group has come out saying, do not use our questions for identification. They were never intended that way. That is not good practice. But sometimes we're still looking for that easy solution for complex issues. So that's different. The identification is what I just described that can be done by teachers and schools and parents. Parents are key throughout all of this, and families. The other issue is diagnosis. Diagnosis is something that can be done by trained professionals and sometimes medical professionals. And quite honestly, diagnosis doesn't really impact education. Because if you come in and say that this child has Down syndrome, well, that doesn't help a teacher at all. Because people with Down syndrome are so different. They're all individuals. That child still needs its own comprehensive evaluation. A diagnosis doesn't tell you how to teach. So that's where I want to kind of put the difference. We're not asking teachers to diagnose, and the diagnosis isn't really what's key in a classroom. So then we talk about literacy. And we talk about the phased approaches of literacy. And what's important to know is because kids have been denied opportunities, often children with disabilities enter school, when they can enter, at a lower rate. They don't have all the pre-emergent skills because they've never been given books. They don't maybe see literacy everywhere. They've never been read a book. So I think it's important we come up with some ideas of how teachers can build those skills in a phased approach in some of those instructions. And then we go through what are those different techniques, and we brought in these experts for different types of disabilities, and we put it in how they learn, how they receive information, so how they receive information, how they express information, what motivates them to learn. For example, students who are deaf, they receive information through literacy is finger spelling is needed, shared learning is needed. They express information through sign language. And what motivates them to learn is often visual and tactile and being engaged, not audio. So how do we kind of go through that? But as we started going through that, we realized, wait, there's a lot of commonalities here. There's way more commonalities than difference. So we created this chart, which took most of the things, it's very small, but it's in the toolkit. But it has different categories, and then it kind of brought together what the different experts said, and you'll see that it's the same in many ways. All children need classroom accommodations. All children benefit from tactile reinforcement and manipulatives. All children require explicit instruction, but there's some differences. Not every child needs hand under hand. That benefits children who are blind. It benefits some children using AAC, but it's not necessarily something that learning disabilities need. So we tried to show it's not as complex as we want. It's just some instructions we can keep going and the next thing we do is talk about assessment, because this is also really big in the USAID world, right? How are kids learning? How is EGRA adapted? And we thank you, Christina, for helping us think through that. What does it look like an adapted EGRA for deaf versus blind versus learning disabilities? And I think that's something we need to, it's still new. We continue to work on this. And so we have this little picture here that says, it's got a monkey and a penguin and an elephant, and says, okay, for the selection, everyone has to take the same exam, climb that tree. And so, that's just not going to work for that elephant, but that monkey's going to do great. So how do we create tests that really show people's learning, not their ability to take the test? And so what we're providing and suggesting is universally designed assessments, and how we can do that in both summative and criterion assessments. So then we go into theory and practice. We go through a lot of things. I'm sure that people who come from the disability community are very aware of the twin track approach, so the need to do disability specific as well as disability integrated. Talk about the models, but kind of give examples of what that looks like in education. So the social model, charity model, medical model, and just to clarify, we're only suggesting the social model versus the medical and charity, which sort of says, oh, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do, or we're going to fix that person. That's not the model we want. But I also wanted to kind of, what we looked at is, this seems really big. It seems huge. But there's a lot of opportunity because countries can leapfrog over our mistakes. They can use these small amounts of money that they have in a more effective way. But what we see is that countries making the same mistakes going forward. I see people doing assessment centers and building them. And we actually know assessment centers, you don't want them because let's be in classroom. So that could save money. So how do we learn and share that information from other places? The other thing that we see is we have some bad examples out there, right? And so we came up with some do's and don'ts for implementing inclusive education. So do this, don't do that, Don't put a child in with an interpreter who's learned for 2 weeks. Do put allow a child who's deaf to learn directly from a student whose teacher is fluent in sign language. So things like that. We also people have asked another question, well, where do I start? Where do we go? Give me a roadmap. And here's the thing is we can't have a roadmap for all early grade reading. Why do you expect a roadmap for inclusive education? The fact is that it changes by each of the countries that we work. Every country has its strengths, every country has its challenges. So what you need to do is find out who the stakeholders are, engage them, figure out where they are, and then how do you build it? And how do you plan for inclusion? How do you think through, well, okay, they're doing these things, but we could strengthen some of these things, and then we can build these priority things. So thinking it through it strategically. And then also some suggestions on, well, how do you move from segregation to inclusion? We actually have some answers on that. These are the first countries who've done this. So we have some lessons learned that we can share. How do you take effective programming that's small and make it larger? Because what we see a lot in the disability world is like a one little program that's never scalable, and then when the person leaves, the program ends. So how do we change that? Another big interesting thing is the gap of research. As we were going through this, again, we looked at like 700 documents, or I think even quoted in this research is quoted in this. But the fact is that most of our instructional approaches are from high-income countries. That when you're doing research in low-income countries, we've focused on teacher attitudes and maybe just inclusion in general, but we don't know for sure how response to intervention can happen in a rural place with a high classroom. So there's a need for all of us to take responsibility of doing more research so we can share it. We have a pretty good sense that it is applicable, but we need that research to move. Then we also need to share those practices. So once you have those research, once you have it, that your other implementers can learn from it and then build it from there. We'll be releasing soon with the toolkit a user's guide. So it'll be a shorter, and it'll also be easier for translation. About 10, 12 pages, sort of highlighting some of the key things, answering some questions, letting them know where to go, but also say, okay, well, now you've got this big document, what do you do? So what you do is, okay, well, what's my role? Who am I? And then you kind of think through your role through it. Then you think through, okay, where are we? And then you can think through, okay, well, we're doing IEPs, but you can go to the IEP section and say, why are we doing it according to the evidence-based practices? So how do you learn from that? Then you can plan. So how do we plan on this? How do we move forward? Then implement, and then again. So to end, I want to share one of my absolute favorite quotes, which is, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. And this is from Helen Keller. And I remember talking to my colleague Andrea Shuttle there. She once talked about Helen Keller. She's like, well, don't just end it with her. She gets to learn water by the water, learns water by the pump. That's where people think Helen Keller. But Helen Keller is so much more, right? She learned literacy not in one language, she learned it in 5 languages. And she went on to become a Nobel Peace Prize nominee in 1952, and she's a founding member of the ACLU. And I think, wow, what would our world be like without Helen Keller? But Helen Keller was both deaf and blind, and without communication, without support, she was communicating just through behaviors. And so it took a teacher to come in and believe in her and give her those opportunities so she could reach her full potential. And I just want to think, are we letting kids reach their full potential? And what can we do as a collective group to give every child that advantage so that we don't miss out on the Helen Kellers of the world? So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. So I could do this really quickly and just say that was fabulous. It was really comprehensive. Get it, read it, just do it. Right? I could do that. But I did promise to provide and I think that's just fair. And I just want to start off with a point that Anne raised, and that is that, the numbers tell us a story. But the numbers tell us a very grim story. And they certainly tell us that we're failing children with disabilities. And so at this stage, I think it's really important. I think we've reached the tipping point to move away from the rhetoric, to begin to look at how we can operationalize inclusive education. Because I think that that's going to help us bring on board the naysayers. So really thinking about the how is essential, and I think this toolkit helps us think that through. What I think is also really important is when we talk about the how, we also move away from just thinking about access. and really start thinking about learning and learning outcomes. And so again, this toolkit provides a lot of thinking and support to do that. I think we're also at a particularly interesting time and point in history. The global architecture, particularly the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, talks to education, makes specific reference to inclusive education. We have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which in Article 24 requires states that have ratified it to obligate them to enforce inclusive education systems in their country. And right now we have 179 countries that have ratified the convention. So this is something that countries have signed up to. There's an obligation for them to do it. And so those two important pieces of global policy already set the stage, and the toolkit helps us think through what that may look like. I think one of the important takeaways that I hear from the toolkit is that early grade reading programs should be addressed for all students. And we know that there have been major deficits in learning across the board. But for children with disabilities, they're even further. And if we were to drill down in terms of children with disabilities, you can really unpack children with physical disabilities, children with blind, children who have multiple disabilities, and perhaps right at the bottom, kids with intellectual disabilities. And so even for the disability sector, it's important to understand our own, I don't want to say prejudices, but our own inability to address the various types of disabilities in a good way. So I think what I'm hearing, Anne, is that I don't think I'm hearing. I know for a fact that inclusive education is really growing. There's a lot of momentum around it. And obviously this toolkit is one, but the recent Global Disability Summit that was hosted by DFID in July in London spelled out some key commitments that governments, bilaterals and multilateral donors have made around inclusive education. And I'll just share with you the one that the World Bank made. The World Bank committed to have all of its education projects disability inclusive by 2025. That is huge. These are strong commitments, and these will fundamentally change the way we design education projects within the World Bank. So, I think that we're really at a point in time that's saying, there's no going back. We can only go forward. And to do that, we need to have the types of toolkits that Anne has developed. At the World Bank, we're also very fortunate to have received a grant from USAID. And I mentioned this because I think it shows the interest that the donor community has around inclusive education. And this grant is to focus on inclusive education in Africa. And what the bank has done is to design a program that will look at a very robust diagnostic of what's happening on the continent. And the idea here is really to try and bring in some new knowledge. And so we're really also trying to go beyond just how many children are in school, to begin to start thinking about the things that Anne's been talking about. How are children learning? If they're not learning, why aren't they learning? And really kind of have a strong diagnostic around that. In addition to the diagnostic, we have identified 5 countries where we'll be having pilots, but these pilots are linked to ongoing World Bank education programs. The idea there is that they will morph into, mainstream World Bank projects, because what we don't want to do is just have little pilots that, as Anne mentioned, often don't go too far. And then the third pillar of that work is to have a strong dissemination phase. And so working a lot with ministers of education, and this is where I see the toolkit being very useful when we have these type of discussions, to show people that there are tools out there that can be used. And I think that, increasingly we're seeing interest in the establishment of communities of practice and hubs around inclusive education. And again, I think this is something we might want to think about collaboratively. So let me pivot to a couple of key takeaways that I gleaned from the toolkit. The first one is, and I'm really excited about this one, is that it really raises the bar. It raises the bar in terms of inclusive education, again, just from discussing issues around access to issues around learning. And, if we're thinking about, knowledge economies and, looking at the future of work, we have to make sure that we have young people with disabilities that are coming out of school that can participate in those systems. So for me, that's a very encouraging piece that comes out of it. What I also take away from the toolkit is that all children can learn. I know that, but unfortunately, not everybody does. And this is a strong message that needs to be communicated to educators, to policymakers, to people who design programs. So this is it's a very simple message, but it's a very, very strong message. And I think having it in a toolkit that's evidence-based really is very important. I also take away the fact that we need to look at the definition of inclusive literacy and how we understand literacy. And so that I really appreciate, and I hope that we can have some discussions around that going forward. The universal design for learning is obviously an effective way of learning. And as Anne mentioned, that comes off the back of using universal design for architectural and barrier-free access. And so we know it's a good way of learning. It's good for children with disabilities. It's good for children who are learning in their mother tongue. It's good for children who are in remote areas. It's good for refugee children. I mean, it's just a good way of teaching. And so hopefully it'll gain some traction amongst educators and policymakers. And really, hopefully, it can begin to be the way classrooms operate and teachers teach and students learn. So I'm really excited about that. And I would really encourage you when you do the shorter piece to highlight the universal design for learning, because I think that it's something that we're talking about more in the States, but it hasn't begun to trickle down to many of the countries in which we work. And as you correctly pointed out, and I think what's really exciting about this time is that as we work with our client countries, which are mainly in the global south, what we can do is leapfrog 20, 30 years of bad experience, right? And so having these type of concepts already spelled out that are operational and shareable is a tremendous contribution to educating children with disabilities. I think the other important piece, and it would be interesting to think a bit about how we can use this toolkit to really help engage other countries to share their experiences, right? So maybe a community of practice around this, to develop kind of a space where people can share their experiences, good or bad. So a learning platform so that people can engage. I think that could be something that's very, very interesting. And then I think, you mentioned the point around curricula and the importance of that. And often we don't see that in discussions when we talk about inclusive education. But it's fundamental if we're looking at changing systems. And so looking at more inclusive curricula is definitely very important. I think it's also important for us, and I say this all the time, to note that when we talk about inclusive education, when we talk about education for all, we have to recognize the constraints and limitations of the client countries in which we work. And this is where the language from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is very important. And international human rights is very important. Because here we're talking about progressive realization. We're not suggesting that overnight in the rural part of Malawi that the school will be automatically, universally designed for learning. We're not suggesting that. But what we are insisting on is that you are not going to build barriers, and those barriers don't need to be physical barriers, and you're not going to discriminate against children because of their disability. And what progressive realization means in this regard is that you need to show levels of planning that are beginning to say, or beginning to address how you will educate children with disabilities within a time period, and let it be budgeted for. So that's a huge pivot, right? And I think it's an important one for us to reinforce, because I think if you don't do that, you might get a lot of policymakers just saying, as you said, well, we're not quite ready for that. We're still struggling with girls. So I think it's really the way we package and the messaging that we take to the table that's important. And then I think finally the important piece that comes out of the toolkit is everybody's business. And that everybody has a role to play in terms of improving the literacy of children with disabilities. And I think we often think that this is the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. Well, yes, it is, but it's also the responsibility of think tanks, of academics, of policymakers, of other relevant ministries, right? Ministries that might have a peripheral responsibility in terms of ensuring education for children. It's responsibilities for disabled people's organizations, for families, and certainly for child rights activists. And so I think it's important that we think about the responsibility around inclusive education as not just something that is for the educator or for the teacher. And then I think, I just want to close by saying that often there's this kind of difficulty because we say we will educate all children. We will opt for universal education. But once you start unpacking that and scrutinizing that, it's actually not all children, and it's actually not universal education. And so while we want to talk about all being all, we have to be very specific that we carve out that space for children with disabilities. And then when we talk about children with disabilities, be very honest with ourselves about making sure that we're talking about all children. So thank you very much. It's a great piece of work, and we certainly will share it amongst the bank staff, and I'm sure many of you in the audience will do. So well done.
I wanted to just another round of applause for both Anne and Charlotte. And I just wanted to remind everybody, this was mentioned in the beginning, we do have some display copies of the toolkit on the table. So please feel free to go through it. So please do go through them. However, they are display copies. So we're going to go into the question and answer session now. If you could announce your name and what organization you're from.
Yeah, I'm Collier. I'm with Creative Associates. Thank you for the presentation. My question is about identifying and screening, and I see some inherent risks in identifying students with disabilities because of all the fallout that you might get socially and so forth. Like parents taking the kids out of school and all of these consequences, especially if you don't have a follow-up plan. Can you talk a little bit about what those risks are and how to best mitigate them?
My name is Carlos Campbell from Mozambique. I'm a human rights activist for people with disability. I don't really have a question. It's just a comment to add on the how dimension of the toolkit. And I think that one of the biggest challenge that we have in countries like Mozambique is that people just don't believe that it's possible to do inclusive education. So when you start talking about putting together different kind of people in the same classroom, they just think that you're saying something crazy. So a big dimension of the how is actually to make people believe, and their skepticism has reason. So maybe work on those reasons and see how can we address that.
Eric Eversman from Save the Children. And just a question, is this primary, pre-primary? How did you deal with early childhood education? Does it cover a span? Are there special strategies? Anything else you can add about that?
Hi, Ellen Schwartz from Waters and Associates. I have a broader question. As Charlotte mentioned, we can create a community of practice. If you could give a couple of examples what this community of practice would look like.
So we'll take those 4 questions first, and then we'll go online.
So the risk of screening, I think that is a risk, especially when you identify to exclude. So honestly, what we are trying to suggest is looking at children that have additional learning needs, not putting a label. Because quite honestly, when you're hungry, when you're facing abuse at night, that looks a lot like a learning disability. And it'll go away if you address the issue of abuse and whatnot. So, but do we really care? I mean, if a child is struggling because they're hungry, or if a child is struggling because they have a learning disability, the techniques that you address that is the same. So it's really more about who's struggling and who needs additional support. And we don't need to put a label on a child in order to do that. So I think that's what we're looking for is screening. The other issue is that, I mean, but there are some things, like if you need glasses, you need glasses. So how do we screen and then refer? And you have to involve parents in that. And I think effective screening and evaluation processes engage the parents from the very beginning and also educate them throughout the way. Like, hey, it's okay. It also means educating the schools that when you identify that maybe a child has additional learning needs, you don't get rid of them. They're still there. So I think there's a level of awareness and education that needs to go around to everyone. But I think the other issue I have seen with screening is that we want these, 10 questions to say this child has an intellectual disability. And when we do that, we're doing harm. So we need to stop that right away. Instead, what we need to do is say, okay, well, here's a bunch of different tools. Who's struggling and what do they need? That's the issue. And then what tools do we give that teacher to then address that student's need? And we have some of those tools. We can provide that. So I think it's moving away from label and moving towards support. The issue of how to make people believe, and I've worked in Mozambique, and so I've seen, there's barely few segregated schools. And so it's a hard thing. But I think that's where DPOs come in, right? They're the best people to let people know the capacity of persons with disability or people with disability themselves. So education needs to be a part of our platform, and we need to educate them, because sometimes I've seen DPOs that come in and they start advocating for segregation. So how do we get everyone online and first work with them to understand, no, it really does benefit children with and without disabilities. And how do we do community awareness? Because we'll get there. We know that where people with disabilities were in Mozambique were much worse 20 years ago, but it's gotten better. It's because of awareness and because of rights activists. So I think that's just something we need to have as a component. The pre-primary and the primary is definitely important. And we actually borrowed or used a very cool thing from the National Council on Children Who Are Deafblind, and it's called Steps to Literacy. And we started looking at this and I'm like, wow, this is for every child. It's just really good, but it was actually meant for children who are deaf-blind, but we started saying, okay, well, this also works for children with intellectual and learning. And then we said, but it's kind of missing sign language and it's kind of missing Braille. So we pulled in some of this prerequisites for Braille or for literacy sign language like Gallaudet did, and we incorporated it. And we also incorporated some stuff from Braille about what are those foundational steps that you need to get even before you can get to pre-literacy, emergent literacy. And then some strategies on each of those steps, because ideally we would have inclusive early childhood development, but we know that that's also not happening. So you have a child who is, blind arriving at school who's never touched a book. So, children who are blind should be handed books so they can learn to turn pages and know orientation, but they don't even have that because parents aren't giving them that. So I think we do address that in one of the sections in chapter 3 on pre-literacy and emergent and early childhood, and kind of thinking through some of those strategies. And then if you're a teacher and you have a child who shows up without those skills, what are those foundational skills that you may need to backtrack? All my other kids are coming in at this level, but this child's been denied this level. It's not that they don't have capacity, they've just been denied that ability. So what do you need to backtrack, and how do you kind of build them on that way? So we do address that, and it's a very important issue.
Before I do the community of practice one, I did want to pick up on the question around the comment from Mozambique, because I think it's an important one. And I feel like if we're going to make those changes, we need to really begin to address a lot of social norms. I think we need to really think through how we change mindsets. The idea really is to normalize disability. And that's important, and it has to come from many different places. Having good laws that are implementable and enforceable is really important. But you can't just have the laws. You've got to have a whole kind of social fabric that really recognizes the value of persons with disabilities. So socializing and breaking down those negative mindsets is really important. And as Anne said, I mean, we have come some way. We're not there yet, but we've come a little way. In terms of the community of practice, so one of the things that we're working on at the bank is an inclusive education initiative. And within that initiative, we would like to establish a community of practice around inclusive education. And this is something that many of the donors have expressed interest in. So it's very kind of nascent in its formation. We haven't actually pulled it together. It's a thought. We'd be really happy to continue these discussions with you to see if there's an appetite. So yeah, it's very much ongoing thinking. But I think there's definitely a need to have places and spaces where people can share experiences, share knowledge, ask questions amongst their peers. So we're looking at that. So if you're interested, let me know.
We have one question online.
To what degree do you attend to students with a specific learning disability in reading, including dyslexia? The second question being somewhat related. I was wondering if the toolkit addresses the issue of children with multiple or severe disabilities, particularly behaviors, how to encourage strategies explicitly on their inclusion in the general classroom, literacy education, when many times they are even excluded from the integration classroom.
Yes, so we address both. And we were able to bring in experts on both of those topics. So we have a professor who has spent her entire career on learning disabilities and literacy, and she helped us think through that. And actually, it was her suggestion to combine learning disabilities, emotional disabilities, and attitudinal disabilities, because she said the instructional techniques are the same. The way in which the intensity differs by your needs, but the instructional techniques are the same. So we really relied on her, and we do address it. The other thing is multiple disabilities is definitely something we address, and we address it throughout. We have a whole section on it, which we have the National Council on Deaf Blind and some people from Perkins International help us think through, because we recognize that these children are often, as you said, excluded from both. Behavioral is something that's important because all children have behaviors. And we also try to address that sometimes children, especially, we try to show the link between traumatic, like trauma, and learning. And that while this child may not have, in fact, Norma helped us write that section, while a child may not have an actual disability, the impacts of trauma will impact it, and they'll show behaviors. So we don't go into too much about behavior modification, but we talk about some systems for behavior modifications, and particularly the multi-tier, I'm going to totally blank on the MTSS, which is a mix between response to intervention and positive behavioral supports, so looking holistically at a school, and recognizing that's a little hard to do maybe up front, but you can build towards it. So we do talk about that and address it. Norma, do you have anything else to add on?
Being deaf, the language aspect is not the only block. Sometimes it's suppressed by families at home. So they're not always getting the love and support from their family members. If they don't get that, that can also significantly impact their learning. That doesn't mean they can't learn, they don't have the ability to learn, but it will be difficult to learn if they can't have expression and communication. So that's another issue we have to address. And of course, there are different layers relating to learning with deaf children.
Behaviors happen for a reason. It's a communication technique, exactly. And so when you do it well, you look to say, why are those behaviors happening? And you try to address them before they happen. So there's been some great research out there, but I mean, children have, behaviors are a communication reason. They're not just behaviors, the kid's trying to get something across. So what are they trying to get across, and how do we address it?
My name is Amina Sajalo. I actually have two questions. I'm from CRS. The first question is around teacher development. Is there any guidance in the toolkit around pre-service and in-service teacher training and development on supporting these new instructional techniques for engaging all learners? And then my other question was regarding specific learning assessments for children with disabilities. I know you talked a bit about how traditional assessments at like the project level, like EGRA, ASER, don't necessarily encompass how children with specific disabilities learn. Where are we with that in terms of creating assessment tools that actually measure how these children learn, since they're so productive based, a lot of them?
My name is Stephen Luke. I'm from FHI 360. And related to the question around community of practice, FHI 360 and Save the Children lead an education equity research initiative. Within this initiative, there is a focus area on disabilities. We do have a team of people made up of members from global agencies like USAID, UNICEF, World Bank, and we also have implementing organizations. Many people here are familiar with this and are participants already, but for those who are not, I wanted to let people know that there are a number of research questions that we are working through over the course of this next year, some related to identification, some related to effective interventions, others related to sort of gaps between policy and practice. So I have found, we started this initiative focusing on disabilities a little bit more than a year ago, and I have found it to be a great community of practice. So I would invite people who are interested to touch base afterwards. I'm happy to share more information.
Jerry Mendez. I guess as an implementer and an advocate, I guess my question is around special schools. We still have them in the United States 40 years after the Educational Handicap Act was passed. How do we, but they've evolved. Do we help special schools in the developing world evolve in the same way, or do we close them down?
So the first question about teacher training, we definitely address teacher training. We don't go into too much detail because it's, it would probably take up too much space, but we talk about what needs to be a part of it. And I think also is who needs to be trained. And I think, again, looking at that hierarchy of supports. So not just training the general ed teachers, not just doing special ed, not forgetting that if you don't just need special ed or forget the general ed. So how do you kind of do this holistically? Again, I think there's probably more that needs to be on that, but we give some, basic introductions. And we also should say every chapter has a lot of resources, like go to this resource, and we kind of vetted some of these resources that you can go to. So we have lots, and all of them are online. So the other thing is specific assessments. And I think we have some good examples of, for example, early grade reading that has been done. It's been new, so the information isn't always getting out there. So we talk about some of those lessons learned that have happened by those who have implemented it. And then we talk about some of the criteria that need to be in universal designs for assessments. So what does that look like? What does that mean? One thing we tried not to do was actually give any, someone said, do you give an example of an IEP? Do you give an example of an assessment? And we didn't. But we did that, we didn't do it intentionally because it just, that's just needs to be vetted and piloted, and it can't come up with a few people. So I think those are the things that would be helpful moving forward, are sort of like examples of tools that have worked. And maybe that's something that can be highlighted in community practices, because I think that's something people want. So for segregated schools, there are some segregated schools in here, but they typically don't have students in them anymore. I mean, there's few, but even the ones that exist are very rare, and they tend to be schools for children who are deaf, which is something that needs to stay around because that's their preference and that's aligned. But there's not a lot of, 98% of children who are deaf in this country are mainstream. There's only 2% that aren't, and those are typically children who are medically fragile, and so being around other children would be a detriment to their health. And so that's something the American Federation for the Blind have really focused on. Schools like Perkins, with the first school, they still have it, but most of those children are medically fragile. So what they've evolved over time is becoming a resource center. So they're a resource center to community, people come in, they go to classes, so they become more of a center to go through. And I think you're right, do we close them down? But there's some wonderful resources. Maybe they don't look like what they look like now. The kids don't come there, but we, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some great technical experts, but where they're going to look different. So what's going to happen is that instead of them giving direct instruction, these Braille experts, deaf experts, they'll go out into communities and help the special ed teachers, who then can help the general ed teachers.
Does the toolkit talk about that, or?
It does.
Because I think that's something that we need to talk about as a community with our donors and our ministries, because I think they don't know what to do with those schools. And there's a stigma about it. There's a stigma and that stigma affects children who go to those schools.
Yeah, no, that is definitely, we have frequently asked questions. We have it in the phased approach, how you move from segregation to inclusion. and then we specifically address it in frequently asked questions that we hear from implementers like you that talk about, well, how do I do this? How do I do that? And I think as we start using the toolkit, again, this is a first edition, hopefully we can expand those frequently asked questions to more, see what else can come up. As we start implementing, we're going to have more questions, but it is something. We also talk about what the policy says. And the general comments number 4 on the CRPD say very clearly, you cannot maintain a parallel system and an inclusive system at the same time and be aligned and compliant with the CRPD. Because people keep saying, well, we'll get to that, but we're going to keep strengthening. We're going to put more money into these schools that we're going to shut down as we look at inclusion. But then what happens is the money never gets to inclusion. So how do we think through getting that money and making that shift and doing it in a way that's responsible? And then also the other question that comes up is, how do you transition those children?
Right.
And so we give through some suggestions on how you transition and what it is doing responsible for the kids that might have been in a segregated school who have never learned, and then how do you get them responsibly into an inclusive system.
Jeff Coop from Creative Associates. Just one question regarding maybe your thoughts on implementation of multi-tiered systems of supports and providing for kids with disabilities. Oftentimes, implementers will say, well, we really need to focus on the universal primary prevention piece first. But often in our projects, we're asked to deal with those kids at extreme risk right away. And so it seems like oftentimes we're working both at the sort of the universal level and then asked to deal at the tertiary level with kids who really need assistance, whether it's HIV or kids who are at the cusp of gang violence or kids with disabilities. And I wonder whether you had some thoughts just on sort of sequencing, how we deal with the pressures of primary, tertiary, et cetera, and what you would advise.
Jonathan Miller from World Vision asks, so much of our discussion is focused on the deficits of the response of the systems to CWD. Is there anything in the toolkit that shows us how to capture successful efforts, even half measures, that teachers are making? He thinks there are many, in order to better encourage them to build on things they're already doing. Make them cool.
We do talk about strengths. We talk about what's working. And because people will always say, well, that can't work in this context. Well, that's a great thing, but it can't work. So we have case studies throughout the entire toolkit from different countries, from all over. Like, well, here's an example of how transportation worked in Zimbabwe. And here's an example of good policy and the shift from segregation to inclusion from Brazil. Brazil was one of those segregated systems out there, and now they're one of the more inclusive ones. Not perfect, but they made huge shifts in record. So we do provide some case studies to kind of break down those naysayers to show that it can't work. And I do think it's a good point. There are really positive systems. If you go into any place, you'll see some good work. But what's challenging is it may not be good work everywhere, but you see great pockets. So how do you build upon those pockets and expand it? And so what builds on what you work on, what's working, and then also identifying those gaps.
Thank you. It's been fun to join you from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Well, that was first of all, and you did a wonderful job, and Deepa, it's been so great to work with you, so I want to do a shout out. But getting on to MTSS, the very savvy question is a real struggle of where do you start? And in the toolkit, we give a brief overview of MTSS, but we also give some links to the best national centers that have a lot of information. In a nutshell, my friends and colleagues who have been leaders of implementing school-wide positive behavior support in the U.S. have emphasized how they believe that it's important to start at the universal level, because so many of the small group and the tertiary problems are created because there's not a strong universal base. And so once there's a strong universal base, not as many students need the small group and individual. Saying that, there's no one formula. As Anne has said, there may be crises in some schools at the tertiary level, and those really have to be handled before building the strong universal base. I think my best recommendation, that's certainly consistent with the research in this area, is to build a participatory team for the school that includes teachers and administrators and any specialists that are there or in the area that can be brought in, but also members from the DPOs and parents of children with and without disabilities, and look at the strengths that we just talked about, building on strengths, and the needs, and make a plan school by school. But to remember that when there's strong universal, there's less need for the others. When then there's strong universal small group, there's less need for tertiary. So we need to be building comprehensively while we're also dealing with crises. I hope that's helpful.
I think the quote that came early on in Anne's presentation that really resonated with me, because I used to work with this called special needs at a school in Wisconsin, was just to presume confidence. I used to work with kids in the area of literacy with a range of disabilities, and it really made a difference when you approach them with this kind of attitude, to understand them in terms of your capabilities, to highlight those capabilities to the teachers that you work with in the school, to highlight those capabilities to the parents that you work with. So I just appreciated that you brought that up and made me think of my work in the past. Building this community of practice, we're going to discuss with Charlotte some ways forward. USAID is also very interested in this. They're in the process of working on their policy. So I think I've discussed with Rebecca Rose this idea of kind of working step by step. First, coming together with Josh Joseph and Rebecca and thinking about how to present this toolkit to their missions, and giving them some guidance as how to use it and how to work with ministries and how to sort of create a space where we can ensure some really good programs that take us along this step process towards a universal design approach can get into place. So they're doing a lot of kind of internal thinking on that, and we're going to be doing some thinking with them over the next couple of months. So I do want to say that's sort of coming up, and at that time, I think around November when the policy comes out, we'd love to have implementers from the GRN community come in and talk about their experiences, get the mission officers on the phone, let them hear some of the great work you're doing, supported by USAID, but also supported by other organizations that have been really active in this space for a long time. So we do plan to do that. And as I mentioned before, we also I would love to think about how to do this user community thing. I've been thinking about it and sleeping on it for several weeks, but I really need someone to teach me how to do it, how to do it. But I was sort of noting a couple of things, kind of like an online community where we can maybe have a space where folks can find partners. We can have a space where folks might post research that they've been doing, talk about how they're using the toolkit in their programs. I don't know if it's worthwhile to list the don'ts. I feel like if we want to leapfrog, we need to list what the don'ts are, for everybody to see, but I wasn't sure if that was useful. And also to share some of these sample tools, IEPs, how folks have used them in different contexts, connections to disability, disabled people, DPOs, who could be great advocates and supports in countries, and also just share lessons learned. So I don't know exactly what it'll look like yet, but we'll have to do some thinking internally. If any of you have been involved in something like that, please let us know, or shoot us an email and give a link so we could see some examples. Let us know how we can be of support to you, and know that sometime around October, November, we'll kind of really get up and going in terms of other meetings to bring people together. So thanks for coming today, and